Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Gaffer and Gear. Today we're having a look at the Godox SL-200 Mark II. So this is a low-cost entry-level COB light. This is 200 watts, daylight only. Low cost, high color render. Let's have a look. Alright, so let's get straight into it. So I said it's low cost. What is low cost? Well, $350 US, which is about 600 to 650 Australian dollars. Now for that money you get the light, which is quite well built. You get a faceted reflector and you get a remote control. Okay, so let's get straight into the negatives. All right, so the first negative for me is this thing does not run off battery power. It only runs off AC. You can get a more expensive version from Godox that will run off battery though, but not this one. The next negative for me is no DMX. Now, the only reason I mention DMX when it comes to a light like this is you can get 200 watt COBs now with DMX operation. The next negative for me is the lock-offs here. So this is locked off as tight as you can get it, and there is still a lot of play in the stirrup or a lot of play in the yoke, depending on what you call it. And as you can hear there, there's a lot of play, a lot of movement in the Bowens mount. Now, the next negative for me is the reflector. The reflector doesn't have the most even beam on it. In fact, it is probably the most uneven beam of any Bowens mount reflector that I have reviewed. All right, let's get into the positives now. And this is where I contradict myself a little bit. The first positive is the reflector. While it's not very even, it does increase the light output 6 times. So with the reflector on, this is 6 times brighter. You get about 6,500 lux at 3 meters. That is staggering. So even with that amount of light, if you put a very light diffusion on the front of this, like an opal frost, you are going to still get a massive amount of firepower. The next positive for me is the color render. You're looking at a 93 TM30 color vector score, which is very respectable and actually better than the color render scores I get on the COBs that I'm currently using. Now, right down at 10%, that will drop to a 91, which is still a very respectable score. Now, color render is meaningless unless the light has a good white point, and these actually deliver on that. With the reflector on, it was very, very close to the Planckian curve. Now, the worst these were out by was when they were dimmed all the way down to 10%. And even then, they were still within a 1/8 correction gel. All right, the next positive has got to be the cooling fan. It is one of the quietest cooling fans I have heard on any of the lights I've tested. Now, it does turn off. You can, if you need to, turn it off. But when you turn it off, the light does dim to 1/3 brightness. So I don't think that's an issue because I don't think you're ever going to need to turn the fan off. What I do like though with lights where they dim when you turn the fan off is if I'm working in really low light levels, I use that as a low end mode. The next positive, this unit is definitely high speed flicker free. This photo was taken at 1/15,000th of a second and there's not even a hint of flicker lines. And the COB has a protective covering over the top of it. The next thing that's bound to be a positive for a lot of people is the power supply is built in. So you just get your IC lead, stick it in the back, flick your on switch, and you're off and running. All right, so let's get into operating it, and it's pretty straightforward. So you've got 2 knobs on the back. This one here is your dimmer, and you've got a nice big display. Now the knobs have a very positive feel to them, so you can feel them click every time you move a percentage. So that's quite nice. So you can feel what you're doing when you're looking at what the light's doing. The next knob is to do with your menu. So for example, if we press effects, then we can scroll through 8 pre-programmed effects. They're all pretty boring. So you got different flash rates, for example. You've got an effect that's meant to be lightning, something that's meant to be television, something that's meant to be faulty globe, that sort of thing. So just press effects to leave there. The next 2 options are group and channel, and that's to do with your remote control and the phone app operation. So between the groups and the channels, you've got loads of lights you can operate. I'll say this with the phone app, I'm not even going to bother showing it. It is the second worst phone app I've ever come across. The problem with the phone app is it's got, in terms of adjusting your brightness levels, you've got a plus button and a minus button. And so yeah, you can't hold the button down. So if the light was running at 100% brightness and you wanted to run it at 20% brightness, you would have to press the minus button 80 times. So it would quite literally be faster to walk across to the other side of the set, dial in your brightness value and walk back. And the other problem with pressing the button 80 times is everybody on set's going to think you got Tourette's. So not the most useless phone app I've come across, but the second most useless I'm going to rate it at. All right, but the remote control's not too bad. So there is a little bit of lag in the remote control, so let's dial in a value. So I'll just hold my finger down. But what I mean with there's a little bit of lag, this actually does communicate the value to it, so it is always spot on. So let's go 92. It is always, whatever you dial in on the remote is always what comes in on the head. It might take a second or two to catch up to it, but it is always accurate. I cannot say the same for the phone app. The phone app literally just goes up and down in increments. So if you press plus, press plus twice, the light will go up 2 increments. You press down twice, it'll go down 2 increments, but the phone app doesn't necessarily match what's written on the back of the light. You've got a fan on-off button here. Now, as I said earlier, it drops to 1/3 brightness, but I honestly don't think you're ever going to need to use that fan button. This is one of the quietest fans I've come across. Look, I'm going to say this, if your sound recordist complains about the noise of that fan, you've got a pretty crappy sound recordist. And you've got an on-off switch. That's pretty much it. And you can turn the light on and off from the remote. So pretty straightforward to operate. Now, in terms of your accessory options, you've got an umbrella mount underneath and you've got a Bowens mount on the front. Now, the stirrup position on this does allow you to tilt a large modifier all the way down. However, with the play in the stirrup, it's one of those lights where when you set your position for your modifier, when you take your hands off the brake, it will tilt down a little bit. So that's something you've got to compensate for. Now, I did try running this light with some other brands' optical accessories, starting with the Aperture Fresnel 2X. However, the optics on the Aperture Fresnel do not line up to the Godox COB. So the end result is a very spotty beam. I then tried the Nan Light Forza Fresnel and I was very surprised. Not only did this fit, but it flood and spotted correctly, had a beautiful even wide beam and barn door cuts. And I'd go as far as to say that this attachment actually works better on this light than it works on the Forza 200. The biggest surprise for me was when I mounted this to the Aperture Spotlight. With the exception of a very minor hotspot in the center of the beam that you really have to look for, the two of these work perfectly together. Now, you also have a cheaper option for projections, and that is this Godox adapter, which enables you to use a Godox S30 projection system or a Dado light projection system if you happen to have one. Now, it won't be as bright, but it does have very superb optics. We'll take a more in-depth look at this adapter in the next episode of Gaffer and Gear. All right, the last thing I'll check for is color fraying, and this unit has none. So let's have a look. All right, so that's the edge of the beam there, no color fraying. All the way to the other side, no color fraying at all. Okay, that's enough excitement for one day. Let's get into the boring stats. Okay, so we'll start off with lux or brightness. Now, I took my measurements at 3 meters and we'll start off with the measurement with the reflector on. Now, I've taken 2 measurements with the reflector on, one in the center of the beam and one at 25% of the way into the beam because the beam is uneven. All right, in the center of the beam, we got 6,420 lux, and at 25% of the way into the beam, we got 5,519 lux. Now, with no reflector on, we got 1,080 lux. All right, so let's go over the stats with the reflector on, and I've taken 3 sets of readings. One set at 100% brightness, a second set at 50% brightness, and the third set at 10% brightness. At 100% brightness, I got a CCT of 5,533 Kelvin, with a TN30 color vector score of 93%, with 101% saturation. The SSI score was 74. Here is the waveform analysis. And the light was very close to the Planckian curve with a very slim deviation of minus 0.0004 delta UV. At 50% brightness, I got a CCT of 5,522 with a TN30 color vector score of 92% with an average 100% saturation. The SSI was 73. Here is the waveform analysis. and the unit was very close to pure white with a delta UV deviation of plus 0.0003. At 10% brightness, I got a CCT of 5534 Kelvin with a color vector score of 91% with 89% saturation. The SSI was 71. Here is the waveform analysis. And the light had gone slightly more green with a delta UV score of plus 0.0015, which is still well under a 1/8 correction gel. Now for the results with no reflector, and again I've taken 3 measurements, 100%, 50% and 10% brightness. At 100% brightness with no reflector, I got a CCT of 5506 with a TM30 color vector score of 93% with 100% saturation. The SSI score was 74. Here is the waveform analysis. And the light was slightly green with a delta UV score of 0.0007. At 50% brightness with no reflector, I got a CCT of 5516 Kelvin with a TM30 color vector score of 93% with an average 100% saturation. The SSI score was 73. Here is the waveform analysis. And the light was ever so slightly green with a delta UV score of plus 0.0012, which is about half of a 1/8 correction gel. At 10% brightness with no reflector, I got a CCT of 5533 Kelvin with a TM30 color vector score of 91% with an average 89% saturation. The SSI score was 71. And the light was green by slightly less than a 1/8 correction gel with a delta UV score of 0.0020. Alright, so that's another review done, but I just want to finish off with the statement here. I've had 4 lights come in this month for review, all of them very cheap. Only 2 of them got reviewed. The other 2 were not good enough for me to review them. So if I don't think a light represents good value for money, or I think it's a heap of junk, I won't review it. Okay, see you on the next episode of Gaffer and Gear. Take care.